I think this is on now.
Yeah.
Yes.
It should be on.
Yes.
It's working. Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to have you back here. Now I have the honor to introduce you to our speaker, Pierre Bessard, who is the President and Executive Trustee of the Liberal Institute, Switzerland's independent research and educational think tank. Not to steal time from the speaker, I'll just give floor to Pierre, and I wish you an inspiring lecture altogether.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's my pleasure to be here at this ESFL conference in Berlin to give you some brief background on the Liberal Institute. It is Switzerland's oldest think tank working for liberty. It was founded, as mentioned, in 1979, and it has headquarters in Geneva for its French language activities, where it is known as Institut Libéral, and in Zurich for its German language activities under the name of Liberales Institut. This summer we will open a multilingual library of liberty in Bern, the political capital, and our international outreach has always been rather self-evident given the small size of our realm, and also because we think we have something to share, and we feel privileged to be able to also modestly support European Students for Liberty. Today I'd like to share a few thoughts on a topic that is strongly related to the conference theme of open borders, voting with your feet, and individual liberty. For that, I will use several case studies, among which Switzerland, because despite its size, it is very relevant as Europe's economically freest country, according to the Fraser Index of Economic Freedom, where it lies fourth worldwide behind Hong Kong, Singapore, and New Zealand, and as Europe's or the world's most competitive location according to the World Economic Forum Index. Switzerland also stands out with a near record high employment rate or occupation rate of over 80% and a near record low unemployment rate of below 3.5%. And the Swiss don't necessarily like to discuss those facts because they fear that it will attract the wrong kind of attention, and they sometimes seem to do everything they can to worsen their rankings, which are of course only relative rankings in a very imperfect world. And it is also a politically incorrect case study, given that the country is not a member of the European Union. But let me first specify what I mean by the idea of voting with the feet. Well, basically, I mean the traditional opposition between voting at the ballot box, that is sending a piece of paper every now and then during a vote or an election, and physically walking out of your country or region and moving to a jurisdiction more favorable to your personal life or your economic activities. Voting with the feet is a traditional feature of political fragmentation, the multiplication of small states and city-states, and real federalism in the sense of devolution and division of power with limited central government and the free movement of people across borders. The economist Albert Hirschman, who was born in this great city of Berlin almost exactly 100 years ago, since he was born on April 7th, 1915, described this opposition in his famous treatise, Exit, Voice and Loyalty, which applies to private firms as well as to polities. Loyalty in politics expresses a certain kind of tolerant and healthy patriotism, the feeling of caring for your place of residence so that you are more inclined to put up with your country's shortcomings or try to improve and reform it rather than to leave. Voice is protesting and taking part in the political process where majority rule prevails. But as we know, one vote does not make much difference, and the main political parties with time tend to cater to the median voter so that differences are often minimal. Revolution is another strategy of voice, but basically entails very high risks and no guarantee of real progress, as recently evidenced in Northern Africa. Often, therefore, there remains only exit, that is, emigration, as a way out of an adverse political environment, and that is a trade-off that each person needs to figure out individually. The idea of ballot box democracy is not actually sufficient to safeguard individual rights, and this is nothing new. Many liberal thinkers have criticized unlimited majority rule and have thought of ways to defend minority rights. The Lausanne-born Enlightenment philosopher Benjamin Constant, whose Principles of Politics, by the way, are available in English at Liberty Fund, Benjamin Constant very eloquently stated that on those matters on which the law must not pronounce, the will of the majority is no more legitimate than that of the tiniest of minorities. In other words, political democracy is only legitimate if it deals with what belongs to the public sphere, but not if it enters your private life. Obviously, no one would like to subject the choice of his or her girlfriend or boyfriend, the music you listen to, your field of study or work, to the choice of or to the will of the majority, of any majority. So democracy, from a liberal standpoint, is only acceptable if it is used to safeguard individual liberty, maximize the private sphere, and minimize political infringements. But the short relativist argument on political democracy is that you cannot eat a piece of paper. The piece of paper being, of course, the ballot paper. And this is best exemplified in poor countries that are sometimes democracies, the largest being India, often called the world's greatest democracy. Well, India is a very dramatic example that you can't eat a piece of paper. According to the World Bank, in democratic India, over 2/3 of the population live in absolute or near absolute poverty. Prior to the last elections in India, and that's where this picture comes from, the democratic Indian government was widely criticized for a scheme to buy votes among the poor. What did the democratic government do? It launched the world's biggest food welfare program ever to supply subsidized rice to about 810 million people, 2/3 of the population, at a cost of about $20 billion US. Why? Because its popularity was falling, especially among the poor. What would seem at first sight a generous gesture from a humanitarian standpoint is less convincing if you consider that India ranks 111th out of 152 countries examined in the Fraser Index of Economic Freedom. And according to Transparency International, the Indian government is also one of the most corrupt governments worldwide. And the fact is that in poor democratic countries, corrupt politicians just as often come to the idea of buying votes with welfare as in rich countries. And if they don't, people actually sell their votes for food, as it regularly happens in African democracies, for example, where individuals sell their voice for a portion of millet. So my point here is that political democracy in itself has little value beyond perhaps the price of a vote. It is a process for collective decision making, but it tells us nothing on the scope and quality of the decisions or the quality of the decision makers. You can have democracy and be actually starving. Political democracy in itself is of little relevance for individual liberty for the betterment of human lives, and for the increase in life expectancy or the standards of living. In fact, these are positively correlated to a different kind of democracy, namely market democracy, where entrepreneurs, investors, and consumers vote with their euros or their francs, what we generally call economic freedom. We should also keep in mind that the opposition today is not between democracy and absolute monarchy or single ruler state, as it was in the Middle Ages, at least in most parts of Europe. The opposition today is between the politicization or collectivization of society through the democratic process, in other words, democratic socialism or social democracy, and individual liberty. If we now look at our case study, Switzerland, which often considers itself the fullest democracy, but as I alluded to at the beginning, is above all a market democracy, well, it was precisely not established as a political democracy, but as a classical liberal republic, or more precisely, as a republican confederation of several sovereign territories. In 1291, the principles held at the founding against the Habsburgs' tax tyranny were not ballot box democracy, but typical functions of limited government, namely the provision of defense against external aggression and the administration of justice based on individual property rights and an impartial judiciary. No majority could have outvoted a minority to redistribute funds in their favor on that basis. The Confederal Pact of 1291 explicitly condemns theft and provides that whoever deprives another citizen of his goods or causes damages to them will have his goods confiscated by way of compensating the victim. There was no place for a democratic welfare state in that constellation. And the federal Constitution of 1848, in turn, which was modeled on the US Constitution, was essentially a classical liberal constitution strongly limiting government prerogatives. Individual freedoms such as the freedom of commerce and trade, the freedom of movement and establishment, and religious freedom strengthened the ideas of the old confederation that earlier had also inspired the American founders. In fact, Switzerland's liberals deliberately established a system of limited majority rule. The first powerful break on political democracy is the extensive political fragmentation of the country, as the Constitution gives the cantons or federated states and the many municipalities all competencies that are not explicitly delegated to the central government. The central government has traditionally been comparatively weak and technocratic, with 7 members elected by parliament, not by the people, and a rotating presidency with largely ceremonial roles, which considerably limits government activism. And even in today's out-of-control welfare state environment, constitutional limits to government expansion remain relatively robust. For example, federal tax rates and VAT rates are constitutionally capped, which requires a double majority of cantons and voters to raise them. A constitutional debt break also places very effective limits on political majorities to spend other people's money and engage in discretionary political vote buying. These institutional limits on majority rule are the reasons why Switzerland today has a comparatively favorable debt ratio of 35% of GDP, and the tax burden and government spending, still far too high by our standards, are well over a quarter lower than in most of Europe. But what can be said then about direct democracy, which seems the most accomplished form of democracy? Well, it is certainly a paradox, but in the Swiss experience, direct democracy tends not to lead to more collective decision-making, but to less. Direct democracy generally does not mean more social democracy, but less political power. It is therefore, in my view, incorrect and superficial to see direct democracy merely as an extension of political democracy. It is, in fact, essentially an additional check on power. It limits the scope of representative democracy and politics in general. A significant example of this, a historical example, is the refusal by over 60% of voters in 1931 to introduce a pay-as-you-go pension system after politicians had been trying for 3 decades since the end of the 19th century to impose one. And 18 countries in Europe had already a Bismarckian type social security system back then, but the stubborn Swiss still refused it. And this is an illustration that the welfare state was never intended to help people, but as a mere extension of political power. People didn't want the welfare state because they could manage their pensions very well with their own savings and within their own private arrangements. In the post-war period, politicians finally got their way, but the relatively strong capitalization of the pension system today is also due to citizens defending their individual liberty and property rights against political democracy. That they do this through the ballot box is again a paradox, but it's certainly not a case for more political democracy. Direct democracy is not a majority rule problem when it gives citizens a veto right on political activity such as new spending, new regulations, or tax increases. It is simply a check on political power. However, direct democracy can be a problem when it becomes itself a force for more political activity, as is often the case with popular initiatives seeking all kinds of new restrictions and interventions. A recent example is the approval by citizens of a proposal for a nationwide cap on the building of new holiday residencies, allegedly for environmental reasons. And in such a case, direct democracy clearly amounts to a tyranny of the majority. In that regard, Switzerland also has a majority rule problem with its direct democracy, in that, in principle, a popular majority can legalize any violation of individual rights, such as governments and parliaments regularly do. On the whole and over time, however, citizens engaged in direct democracy tend to vote in favor of individual liberty and economic freedom. They tend to vote for their own interest. And as mentioned, for constitutional matters, direct democracy further limits political activity by the double majority required of cantons of the federated states and citizens. Small cantons have the same weight as the larger ones. The smallest canton has 35,000 people, the largest 1.4 million, yet they both count the same. Recently, for example, a majority of cantons turned down a proposal for giving the central government competencies in the field of family policy. A majority of citizens, unfortunately, approved that plan, but a majority of cantons did not, which buried the proposal. A more spectacular instance was the government plan in 1975, 40 years ago, when I was born. A plan to introduce a constitutional disposition to allow Keynesian-type interventionist economic policy to allegedly stimulate the economy. A minority of liberals in parliament fought against this proposal, but a fairly substantial majority of voters approved the government proposal, while the vote of the cantons was 50-50. The outcome was 11 states against 11. Since there was no majority of cantons, The constitution could not be changed, and Switzerland was preserved from the naive Keynesianism prevailing back then. And today the consensus is that government economic stimuli just don't work in any kind of environment, but especially not in a small and open economy. In such cases, the constitutional safeguard against democratic socialism clearly worked well. If Parliament alone would have had a say on these issues, or if majority rule by the people were unlimited, some additional very harmful policy proposals would have passed. But thanks to the safeguards limiting majority rule, they did not. Economic historians also agree that it was Switzerland's liberal institutions, not democracy, that led to its comparatively higher prosperity. In the liberal window of the 1800s, following the Industrial Revolution, a large number of pioneers, some of whom were immigrants from neighboring countries, founded companies that are still successfully in operation today on a global scale, such as Credit Suisse, Swiss Life, Swiss Re, or Nestlé, which was founded by the German pharmacist Heinrich Nestlé, who had voted with his feet from Frankfurt to Vevey on Lake Geneva. However, with subsequent constitutional revisions, this spirit of enterprise was weakened by increasingly centralist and democratic tendencies. I quote the economic historian Joseph Jung, from a book that he recently published on Switzerland's economic success. The pioneer spirit, weakened as the new imperatives of democracy made major achievements more difficult. This is, in my view, a correct interpretation, and the pioneer spirit has been weakened further with the post-war growth of the welfare state. If political democracy, as we have seen until now, in itself is not relevant for prosperity in a direct democratic country like Switzerland, the question remains as to the kind of institutional framework that is the most favorable to entrepreneurial flourishing and individual liberty. The experience of Europe, as well as that of Switzerland, is very clear in that regard. It is above all political fragmentation, namely the diversity and competition of different legal and tax systems that allow citizens to vote with their feet, that explains why some countries and continents have been more successful than others. The great historical example of this truth is, of course, Europe, the most successful and prosperous continent in the history of mankind. And historians agree that Europe owes its historical ascendance to the diversity and fragmentation of political power. The competition between political systems and the absence of centralization have been decisive factors for the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the immense prosperity that followed. After the fall of Rome, Europe's political and religious fragmentation allowed productive individuals to precisely vote with their feet, moving to another place, taking their talents and capital with them. With the division of authority, political dissent could develop, leading to the emergence of free merchant cities and parliaments, curtailing predatory taxation and bringing similar progress elsewhere by emulation. In the words of David Landis, fragmentation gave rise to competition, and competition favored good care of good subjects. Historians even say that if the imperialist idea of making Europe a single political unit had succeeded historically, Europe would have remained a pre-industrial society as many other parts of the world that were previously technologically more advanced. Unfortunately, the dream of political unity and authority has persisted to the present because fragmentation is usually and superficially seen as a recipe for conflict. According to this view, today the European Union and its centralization process are supposed to be the answer to past wars. Yet fragmentation was actually in the history of Europe the strongest brake on political oppression. Political rivalry to attract good residents and those residents' right of exit made all the difference in Europe. As Rosenberg and Birdsell observed in their book, How the West Grew Rich, it may be that a prerequisite for sustained economic growth is an economy trading across a geographical area divided among a number of rival states, each too small to dream of imperial wars and too fearful of the economic competition of other states to impose massive extractions on its own economic sphere. What led to the wars in Europe in past centuries, and especially last century, was not fragmentation, but on the contrary, centralization and the dream of European unity. The best illustration of this is, of course, Germany, whose politics caused so much mayhem on the continent last century. Germany was for a long time one of the most fragmented empire in Europe. From 1648 until the Napoleonic Wars, it consisted of some 234 countries, 51 free cities, and about 1,500 independent knighthoods. After the Vienna Congress of 1815, the number of independent political territories still amounted to 39, yet politicians continued to push for more centralization and unification. The great German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe warned in very vivid terms against these trends. He wrote, "Just assume that for centuries only the two capitals of Vienna and Berlin had existed in Germany, or even only a single one. Then I am wondering what would have happened to the German culture and the widespread prosperity that goes hand in hand with culture." Goethe's warning against political centralization in his country underlines the error of thinking that Europe today should be unified as a bureaucratic superstate to avoid conflicts. The experience tells us that the opposite is true. It was the bureaucratic centralization of nation states and the idea of a pan-European imperialism that led to wars. So, how does voting with the feet apply to our Swiss case study? Well, in a very powerful fashion, since it is by far Europe's most fragmented country with 26 federated states and 2,300 municipalities for only about 8 million residents. This is the reason why I often say that Switzerland is too European to join the European Union, whose centralist tendencies beyond the four freedoms of the Rome treaties are in fact a betrayal of the conditions that led to Europe's extraordinary historical ascent. What are, to sum up, the practical implications of political fragmentation? The most obvious consequence is its beneficial impact on savings, since a more favorable environment encourages capital accumulation. This in turn leads to more entrepreneurship, investment, and more economic well-being. And beyond its obvious effects on prosperity, diversity enables the experimentation of new political practices and innovative institutional ideas. The debt brake I mentioned in the case of Switzerland was first tried and implemented in several cantons, each with their own rules, and eventually the idea reached the central government. And today it is an instrument that also interests a number of other countries. Another example of institutional innovation in Europe is the spread of proportional taxation, the so-called flat tax, in many formerly socialist countries, with Estonia leading the way over 20 years ago. Generally, the closer political decisions are taken, and the easier it is for residents to move to another jurisdiction near their current location, the more public policies will match the residents' actual needs and preferences. There is no economy of scale in government. Fragmentation promotes responsible policies because everybody knows where the mayor lives, and also because local patriotism can flourish with the mayor and the parliament actually caring about the well-being of residents and taking intelligent pride in the good standing of their city or region, rather than the mystical, collectivist, nationalist, racist, idiotic pride of socialists. But this is only possible if the local polities enjoy symmetry of decision-making, financing, and reaping the benefits of their decisions. Finally, diversity and competition are essential conditions for individual liberty. They tend to restrict the predatory potential of the territorial monopoly on the use of coercion. In the case of public activities financed by taxes, as we know, there is no freedom of choice, no inherent incentive to improve the relationship between their cost and their quality, and no clear, effective answer against potential abuses. The existence of small, open, and competing jurisdictions is therefore the best guarantee of restricting a government's capacity to abuse its power. To close with Benjamin Constant, for morality, justice, peace, a certain kind of happiness, and all natural affections, small states are preferable to large ones. It is by sacrificing everything to exaggerated ideas of uniformity that large states have become a scourge for humanity. Their size requires an activism and force at the heart of government, which is difficult to contain and degenerates into despotism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre, once again. This is a certificate. Oh, thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Thank you very much.
Now we have a questions and answer session. So those who would like to ask speaker questions, please raise your hands. We have the first question there.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Martin. Thank you for your wonderful speech. It was actually the topic of my master's thesis, so I'm glad to hear my thesis verified by Swiss themselves. But my question is, I think you somehow voiced concerns on the People's Initiative, that you think that it's not an ideal vehicle, but isn't it true that it can be used to repeal existing bad legislation? I think it was the case with the book cartels and stuff.
Yes.
So, but overall, you still think it's more negative than positive, the People's Initiative, or? Well,
the fundamental issue is political culture. I don't think it is necessarily the institution of popular initiative, but it is political culture. Whether the citizens use this instrument as a way to promote or to preserve their freedom, or as a way to infringe on other people's rights. And you know, there is no, if you look at constitutions over time, you can take the US Constitution as an example. The US Constitution, to my knowledge, has never been really amended in its fundamental content. But the central government today looks very different than it looked when it was founded in the 18th century. So my point is that political culture is really the issue. Institutions can help, but if you don't have an underlying will and consciousness for the advantage of liberty, for the ethics of personal responsibility, and for the respect for other people's property rights, then it will be very difficult with all the most wonderful institutional instruments that you might have to preserve and enhance people's freedom over time. So, and this is also why we are gathered here, and that we are engaged in our own countries to promote these ideas, because it is a cultural fight. So to answer more precisely to your question, I believe that the instrument of popular initiative should not be abolished, but we should strive to make it an instrument for liberty rather than for political interventions.
Thanks for the interesting presentation. I wanted to raise a note of caution, perhaps, to relate to your example of Germany of the early 19th century, because you're right in mentioning that it was very decentralized, but I'm not sure this is a very good example of a decentralized order, because until Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon was, of course, on balance and negative, but Napoleon still managed to demolish in Germany lots of very bad ancien regimes, which actually many of them returned after he withdrew and then were finished off by the Prussian government. So in this sense, I would raise a note of caution, and I would be interested in your response, because definitely those were decentralized regimes, but they were in many ways very reactionary and bad. So how does it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's true. There was a transition period. Europe, as we know, was not a liberal continent before it became more liberal with the development. But the spread of the ideas of the Enlightenment was certainly facilitated by this fragmentation and by the fact that people could precisely move out of those ancien regime jurisdictions to jurisdictions that had already become more liberal. In the Netherlands, in some northern republics of some other countries. So in Switzerland as well. I mean, in the 19th century, it was certainly the case. And so the facilitation through the point is that there is no perfect world. It is simply an arbitrage that operates at the margin. If you have fragmentation, it is much easier for people to move out and establish themselves in a jurisdiction that will be more favorable to their rights than if you have a unified system. This is also the paradox of top-down liberalization. If you look at federal states, Germany, Switzerland, the United States, but also to some extent the European Union, it starts with liberalization from the top. Basically eradicating the borders between the smaller units that may be less liberal for some of them than others, and trying to to establish a kind of uniform freedom everywhere. But with time, the dynamics of the central bureaucracy tends to become more of a threat to liberty than an instrument to propagate it. So it is. You always have to bear in mind that there is never a perfect world. It is an arbitrage at the margin, and at the end of the day, the point is that fragmentation will facilitate this arbitrage by individual entrepreneurs moving out and doing their business elsewhere.
Thank you for your insightful speech. In the light of the presentation yesterday by Sam Bowman from Adam Smith Institute, who made a very convincing case about open borders and the benefits of allowing immigrants into countries, Switzerland has this sort of reputation having at least some cantons in Switzerland for having some very strict immigration policies. What do you think are the shortcomings or benefits in some cantons? I don't know, is immigration decided on the federal level, or is it up to individual cantons? And what do you think could be possibly improved in the Switzerland situation right now?
Well, the general immigration policy is decided at the federal level. When you have a small competitive country in the center of Europe, you have a power of attraction that is above average. And the concerns within Switzerland have been that it is so attractive and there are so many people moving in, especially with the free movement of people in the European Union, where you don't see many Swiss moving out of Switzerland to work as well, but you see many Germans, many French, many Portuguese, many other individuals moving into Switzerland to engage into their productive activities on the basis of a work contract or on the basis of their own business. And so this raises concerns. And as we know, electorally, the scapegoating foreigners, as it were, is a very cheap and effective strategy to buy votes. This can be observed throughout history and throughout the world. If you can oppose one group against another, whether it is the Chinese, the Jews, or the foreigners, it is generally very effective because it appeals to emotions and it appeals to some collectivist idea. And maybe for people who have not achieved so much in their lives, it is a way of having some kind of some kind of national collectivist grandeur to stick to. So this is a fact, and this also happens within Switzerland. But the reality of immigration in Switzerland is generally a history of openness. The permanent population is about 25% non-Swiss, and the foreign-born population is about 35%, so above a third of the population. So it's a very it's a melting pot. When you hear sometimes the political rhetoric, you don't realize that it is a melting pot, but it is. And this is the reality of the population setup. So as you know, there was a vote a couple of years ago, last year, to restrict or to I don't know what will become of that specifically, but I would imagine that there will be an arrangement to keep this openness along with the arbitrage with the welfare state and so on, which is also a big impediment for the free movement of people. Obviously, if people can move into the welfare state. But if I can add this, one of the great strengths of the free movement of people in Europe is precisely that it is not about moving to the welfare state, but it's about moving on the basis of a work contract. And I think that's a huge progress. That's something that was already the reality in Europe 100 years ago, before the First World War. And to have re-established this freedom is certainly a great benefit and a wonderful thing. So we can only fight further for this, and actually fight against the things that need to be fought against, which is basically the welfare state, and not people from other backgrounds.
Do we have more questions? No. Okay, so then I guess thank you very much all for coming.
Thank you.
Giga T, crowdfunding for you and me.